The following is a JourneyWise Network production.
Hey friends, welcome to JourneyWise Podcast. I'm Shane Stanford.
I'm Ronnie Kent.
I'm James Kent.
And today we're going to be talking about how to deal with loneliness and loss. We've just come out of the holidays. There's a lot of impact for people who've dealt with loss or maybe brokenness or a relationship that's not turned out okay, or a job or an ambition, a dream. So how do you deal with that, in which it's not just the loneliness of a relationship, but maybe not accomplishing something or not dealing with something? How do you recalibrate yourself to be able to deal with that in a positive way? And I know that in my life, James, looking primarily at you on this, in my life, I have to be careful to put everything in the right perspective because I can't allow things to get out in front of me. I get out on the tip of my skis, as they would say, become unbalanced, unstable in terms of how I'm dealing with the rest of my life. And that being able to cope with not just the things that I want to cope with and enjoy, but learning how to cope with the things that are not as comfortable does have such a powerful impact on the rest of my journey. What would you say to someone who says, who's maybe lost a friend or lost a spouse, or someone who's dealing with significant loss in their life, and their response to you is I just don't think I'll ever be happy again?
What would my response be? My training would tell me to empathize with that person and say something to the effect of, that sounds pretty miserable. Should that person, even though they can't see it, expect hope later in life or happiness? I think that the answer absolutely, that hope and happiness is not lost to that person. It's never going to be the same. You'll never be, that person you lost will never come back. You'll see them hopefully again in heaven, if you both follow Jesus. But it's a tricky thing. And I guess that leads me to this. Both of you being a long-term pastor who pastored people, counseled people, and then Dad, you being a physician. I mean, I know, Dad, you specifically have had patients die, and even in front of you. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with a situation? And for you, it was always a child as a pediatrician. I mean, talk about just horrible.
I think you have to settle in your own heart, how you're dealing with that. And I remember the first time I had that was still in my training. I was a third-year resident, and we lost a child that we were expecting to lose. I mean, the parents knew that it was a dire situation, and we didn't give much hope just because of the medical aspect of it. And I remember the room that I actually went into to tell them that the child had died. And when I went in, I had stopped before I opened the door, and I said, Lord, I don't know. I can't do this. I can't comfort these people. I mean, I did not, well, I had your sister, my first had just been born. And so I couldn't put myself even in their place. And so I remember opening that door and saying, God, you just take control. And I opened that door, and it was as if the color of the room almost changed. And so I didn't go so much like you did. I didn't go so much as the loss as to almost the gain of that child. And instead of focusing more on their loss, I focused more on that child's gain and saying, I know this is very difficult that few people have to experience. But I want you to know that I have no question that God's got your child in his hands now. Because you do have to tell people because they have passed away. And did the people cry? Were they upset? Absolutely. But they came back and later said, the thought of God holding our child in his hands brought great comfort to us. So not focusing so much on them as I did. And so I kind of took that as I walked through it. And fortunately in pediatrics, we don't lose a lot of people. That makes it both good, but it also makes when it does happen bad.
Sure.
But I kind of took that approach And I was even asked to speak at a couple of my patients' funerals because you have a lot of times such a close relationship because of some chronic illnesses, and that was always my approach to it.
You walk with that person over time, and maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 years. They come to you and say, why is this still going on?
Yeah.
Why am I, where's Jesus? I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, I was just sitting here thinking that I think in the short term is actually, I think you have more people around you, more people respond. You've got the casserole committee that's come together and
very adrenaline.
Very much, yeah, and your emotional adrenaline, if there is such a thing, that has set up. It's looking out for the next emotion. Everything seems good, but then time, which does, I think, heal most wounds. But time is very painful to allow that wound healing to take place. Why do you think time is so difficult to allow to unfold in terms of healing?
I think what you're talking about is very real. I mean, because the adrenaline goes away, the intensity of it. And sometimes those severe emotions are easier to cope with because you have people around you. And here again, it's all about the relationship. So you have a lot of relationships around you to prop you up. And then as much as they want to, they have life.
Yeah.
So they have to start going their own way. And then all of a sudden you're left to experience loneliness. I mean, you are alone, but then you're experiencing loneliness. And I think that if you don't prepare, I've experienced parents that come back and say it's harder now than it was when it happened. And you just say that's normal. And I think normalizing what they're going through is very important, and the stages that they have to go through.
But the nature of that stage, the nature of dealing with that is as important and as needed as, the other aspects of life and relationship. Because, you would never want to withhold your emotions or your affections because you'd be afraid of losing someone. That's not healthy either.
No, I was going to say there's actually something in the manual of diagnostic diagnoses, all the diagnoses put out by the American Psychiatric Association. That book, we call it the DSM, currently in version 5. It actually has something called complicated bereavement.
Okay.
Just getting to your point, it's impossible to be healthy and avoid grief. It's just not possible. In fact, if you avoid grief, it will take over, whether you're a willing participant or not. It will take over and it will wreak havoc. And what will come is you may avoid thinking about whatever it is you need to grieve, but you'll become a very anxious person or a very depressed person or whatever it may be. There's going to be a physical, mental, psychological toll.
Because emotions will manifest themselves one way or the other.
Any way they want to.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, so much to say that, Aaron, not long ago, we actually discovered that some of the people that were diagnosed with epileptic seizures were actually having a psychogenic experience that perfectly mirrored an epileptic seizure, but it was actually related to undiagnosed and untreated PTSD.
Oh, wow. So
the limit of how your mind works is, well, there is no limit. So those emotions, I would just say, and I'm not trying to say that to be dogmatic or even cruel. Nobody wants anyone to have to grieve.
Yeah.
However, I would tell patients all the time, the only way through grief is through it. And so that kind of brings us to what our question is. How do you do this in a good way? Like, how do you say I grieved well? Or, when loneliness comes, I attack it. I have a plan. And I know what I would say, but what would you all say?
I would say, that we talked about last week about being prepared and being organized. I think that has a lot to do in terms of your intentionality with something like this or loss. Is you can't plan every emotion, you can't plan every response, but you can make sure that the relationships you have in your life are as healthy as possible, that you're doing things like your devotional life, your study life that's helping to engage you and to give you the certain tools that you need. So I do think there's an intentionality about the preparation that's important. What would you say?
Exactly. I mean, the relationships, and then take care of the basics. When you have a significant event, you tend to make it too complicated. You think because of the significance of this event or the significance of the emotion that it caused, I've got to do some sophisticated way to recover. Well, I think just the opposite. The more intense it is, the more basic you become. And you tend to sit up at night and neglect sleep. You tend to skip meals and you tend to stop walking like you were walking. And you just go back to those basics because routine has a way of healing.
Oh,
and so
say that again.
Well, routine has a way of healing because you get back to, like James said, you're never going to, the loss is there.
Yeah.
But you can have some semblance of the former life, that happy life. And I think that can bring back with it, as you say, oh, I remember how nice I felt after I walked. Mm-hmm. You can get back to those basics and take care of that, take care of the real relationships in your life. Satan's thing that he caused Adam and Eve to do is still the thing that I think he wants us to do, and that is to hide.
Yeah.
When they sinned, the first thing they did was hide. God went looking for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've got to be careful we don't hide from the significant people in our life or the people that we associate with the one that we lost or the feeling of loneliness, and we re-engage. Here again, put up with a little pain up front, and I think it will pay great dividends.
So why do you think shame or hiding has such a profound hold on us, particularly in these moments when we feel so weak? Why do you think it's shame?
Well, I know that whenever a patient would come in, and obviously it was because they just experienced a great loss. I mean, we would talk about things like survivor's guilt mm-hmm. and regret that I think really, and understandably, they just sort of ravage people. Yeah. The survivors who are left and who were closest to that person. And especially if it was under some sort of tragic circumstance or, the relationship may have been somewhat estranged or, mm-hmm. It's just, there's a lot of relationship components that could be negative and it hurts people.
Even to the mm-hmm. place of feeling somehow responsible.
Okay. I'm sure
that I actually caused this, or that, which is pretty ridiculous, but that I caused them to be in an accident, or that sort of thing. It's amazing to me how Satan, and I really do believe Satan wants to separate us.
Yeah,
he wants to separate us from God and from people in our lives, significant people in our life. That is his tool. It hadn't changed. Since creation, it has not changed. He just is using different ways to make it come about in our life. And any event in our life, be it loss, be it failure, be it whatever, the tool's the same. Mm. He wants to separate us so that we are alone because he knows that alone we are most vulnerable to him.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of reaching back into your relationship with God, and I assume that this is the same in terms of building and reaching back into old relationships with another person. What are some of the things you have to do in order to build that relationship back or to reach back into that relationship with God?
Huh? Read the book.
Read the Bible.
I'm always going to, read that and talk to him. Mm-hmm. But go to Psalms. Read David. David was I'm in a pit. I'm in a slimy pit.
Yeah,
my God, where are you?
Mm-hmm.
Look at even Jesus felt alone. And realize that you read the book and know that there is hope, that hope is there.
Mm. I'd say too, just the more that you can trust God's sovereignty, and what I mean by that is the bigger your God can be, the more capable he is of handling whatever comes your way. And so I'm not saying there's varying levels of how big God is, but for you personally, how big is your God? What can he handle? Can he handle this? And can you avoid asking why? There are some things that we're just not going to know this side of heaven. And we can normalize it too. There's absolutely no reason anyone should ever say, why do you keep asking why? Because we would all do that. I mean, that's a very human, normal thing to want to know. We're just searching for some explanation because we feel so badly. So avoid why as much as you can, and then try to focus on the fact that you've got a really big God, and He has a destination for you, even though you don't know what that destination is. You can't see what's coming next. He's big.
Are there any tools that help you not ask why? Is there anything specifically you can think of as a tool that helps you?
Dad mentioned it. I think staying busy is really important. We don't think about it. You mentioned planning. I think the number one thing that you can do for yourself, whether it's from loneliness, loss, whatever, is you need to come up with a plan. And that plan needs to directly try to mitigate whatever the circumstance you're dealing.
Sure.
So we don't think about it. When you get married, you don't sit down with your spouse per se. You probably do, hopefully, but we don't say we need to have a planning meeting on marriage. But you plan constantly.
Yeah.
You're constantly planning. You're constantly talking about that trip you want to take, where you might want to go to church, who you want to get to know in the neighborhood, constantly. But then, someone passes away, let's say you have a widow or a widower, maybe mid-50s, and all of a sudden, life stops. They can't do anything. Well, you have to plan to be a widow or a widower. You have to come up with an active plan. This is where I'm going to go to church. This is who I'm going to see. This is who, I'm going to go to the Tex-Mex place on Tuesdays with Barbara. Like, you have to have a plan that's practical. It's just not as fun to think about because you're in the midst of such loss.
And it doesn't have to be a plan of great things. It can just be a routine that you get yourself back into it. So where's the church? Where should the church, and I mean we as bodies, as the body of Christ, and then the body of Christ as that place that we attend and worship, where should the church be in terms of responding to people's loneliness?
There. I mean, so many people avoid, I think, and I've done it even myself, so many people avoid going to people who have had loss or that seem lonely because they don't know what to say. You don't have to say a lot.
Yeah.
What can I do to help? I'm with you. I love you. My goodness, I'm sorry. And then just hang with them. Just hang with them. I think, and I absolutely pray for them, but I think I'm going to be praying for you and walk off laughing. I don't mean laughing at them, but, walk off and put your arm around, somebody, and you've got, in our class that we taught, we had several. In fact, they were up on the front row every class of about 5 widows that came, and they supported each other.
Wow.
And yet it was one of them. She was struggling mightily still with the loss of actually a son. And so I think us coming alongside people and providing resources, providing classes. We have a class at our church that is for people that are grieving.
And so support groups is not a bad way to look at this, that you're not always going to find people who are willing to, don't you think, and I guess this is a practical, but probably seems so obvious, but probably the best people to help you deal with loneliness or brokenness are people who have just been through it or who are going through it themselves.
If they're working through it.
Exactly.
If they're working through it, because if they're not, it's the old misery loves company. You don't want to stay in misery,
And I call those people ambassadors. It's kind of categories of ambassador you don't necessarily want to belong to, but we could call them encouragers. But even as a trained therapist, let's say there is a widow who comes in to see me. And if I have the opportunity to connect her with another widow who maybe is just a couple of years or decade in front of her with it, who has faced the hard truths of what's happened and the difficult emotions, I'm chopped liver compared to that person in terms of helping this lady. So doesn't mean I would abandon that person, but I'm just saying if they have access to that. And your question was, how does the church handle it?
Yeah.
The struggle of loneliness, in a sense, anyone who struggles with that shouldn't have to worry about being alone.
Yeah.
Now they're going to deal with internal feelings of loneliness, but that to me is what Dad said. We're there.
And one thing I would like to say that I thought about, and that is, try not to make big decisions.
Okay.
At that time.
Oh yes, no,
because I mean that's just usually a poor decision. I mean, and even sometimes chronic loneliness will cause people to start looking in areas that they would not have looked beforehand for somebody to get over the loneliness.
Is there a certain time frame that you tell people to wait? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? I mean, I've heard variations of both.
I think it's as you work through the stages.
Well, my thing was always, don't do anything without talking to someone important in your life first. So that's kind of a way of avoiding wait 6 months. It's like, well, one day they're going to go to that person. They're going to say, you know what? I think that sounds reasonable.
I've seen some bad decisions made by people. And I'm going to be just right up front with it, in particular in the area of marriage. You know, to lose a spouse and all of a sudden they jump into another relationship, and it's not a good one. And it obviously, you know, it's just not true that any relationship's better than no relationship. I mean, there are some that
that's
can be bad.
And there is a sense of being honest with yourself. You know, I've had widows and widowers who, you know, I'll think to myself, they'll just be very clear with someone they meet and go, you know, I've lost my wife. She was the love of my life. I'm not quite there yet. But in that honesty, it does seem to open the door that you can't. I would rather someone be too honest than not honest enough about these crossroads. Wouldn't you
agree? About themselves, not necessarily about the other person.
About the other person. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. About where you are.
Yeah.
Well, what a healthy thing to do. Just walk around and help the people you encounter know where you're at. I mean, that's pretty generous.
And it's self-healing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Because self-healing.
You're sort of
recalibrate.
Well, and reliving it every time you have to say it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is, if you're that person out there who's lonely, don't sit at home by yourself and blame everybody else. Mm. You have to take responsibility, and you are responsible for asking for help.
So is it good to find someone to be your accountability during these moments?
Oh, absolutely. And not just one person. You need a dozen. I mean,
sure.
If you're part of a church, you need to go to that church and say, look, I'm going to need everything you got. Just everything you got, I'm going to need it here for the next year. Mm. And whatever class you offer, whatever discipleship, whatever, I'm going to need it. And that also means I'm going to need a ministry where I can serve people when I'm ready alongside, because you just need relationships. You just need to be around people.
And if you look at that passage that I always point people to in 2 Corinthians 1st chapter, that we are comforted by the God of all comfort, so that then we can comfort others. And I think that's the formula to me. We receive our comfort from God, but just like everything else we get from God, it's there to help us move along into other people.
My mother used to volunteer at the church in Grieving, grief ministry, and she called it the ugly ministry. And I kept thinking, my gosh, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. You know, why would you call it? I mean, these people are doing the best they can. And she'd say, no, you misunderstand. That their face is never quite done. Anyone who's involved in this ministry is always, you got puffy eyes and crying and disheveled. But yet, she said, it's an ugly ministry against one standard of the world, but the most beautiful ministry against the other standard. Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely.
Hey, guys, it's Shane. We're so excited that you're on this journey, and we want to thank you for joining us. If you like what you hear, it would mean a lot if you'd subscribe to the podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. And, of course, stay tuned to all that God's doing and working to make all of us JourneyWise.